Today's study will be based on the time which we now are living in, distress of nations with perplexity. We learned from our last study that the Greek word used for perplexity is aporero, which means to be at loss, be perplexed, to be without resources. In other words, many will experience decline of temporal prosperity, a global financial collapse. As we mentioned in our previous video, we are living in the biggest debt bubble in the history of the world. The overreaction of the 2008 economic crisis has caused a credit and a debt bubble, and all bubbles pop. Now, in 2020, this debt has increased to $25 trillion. With the current financial system in place, this debt will continue to rise until the whole system collapses under its own weight. When this happens, the whole world will be affected. Did you hear me? Both you and I and our families will be affected. The collapse of the global financial system will start with the U.S. and spread throughout the world, since all of the world currencies are tied to the U.S. dollar. You see, we will show you this in a few minutes. This is why our focus will be on the U.S. economy. The saddest thing about this is that only 1 in 100,000 people know about this. My husband comes from a beautiful island in the Caribbean called Antigua. The population of Antigua is just under 100,000 people. Imagine if only one person in the island knew about the upcoming crisis and was the only one on the island who prepared for it. Can you even start to imagine the distress that this nation will be under? It will be terrifying. This is why we are doing this study, so you can understand, 1, what real money and true wealth is, how real money was replaced by currency, modern banking system, corruption of the current financial system, collapse of the current financial system, introduction of a new policy and rise of a power, and how to prepare. We would like to start with a review of the topics we covered in our last Bible study. The end time events that Jesus revealed to his disciples, the great earthquake, the sun becoming dark, the moon like blood, and the stars falling from heaven, followed by the distress of nations with perplexity, the mark of the beast, then the powers of heaven is shaken, and lastly, the second coming of Jesus Christ. We notice that 4 of the events already took place, and we are now at the distress of nations with perplexity. We also read in the scriptures to see what God's people should be doing between the distress of nations with perplexity and the second coming. We notice the world's response to these events. From 1844 until the National Sunday Law, this is the time where God's people need to start preparing. Then from the National Sunday Law until the close of probation, this is when the loud cry message will be shared with the world. God's people need to have a country lifestyle. This period of time is also when God seals his people. And lastly, between the close of probation until Jesus' second coming, that's when the 7 last plagues will fall upon those who rejected God and accepted the government of Satan and his destruction. So what is money? The conflict of the ages is between the Prince of Peace and Prince of the Air. The Bible tells us that the Prince of Peace will win. There is another conflict that has been taking place through history as well, and that conflict is between money and currency. Most often, this battle takes place between gold and silver and currencies that supposedly represent the value of gold and silver. Throughout the ages, livestock, grains, spices, shells, beads, and paper have all been forms of currency, but only two things have been real money. Yes, only two. Those two are gold and silver. To understand the conflict, we first need to understand the difference between money and currency. You see, currency has the following properties: medium of exchange, a medium of account, portable, durable, divisible, fungible, interchangeable. Money is all of the above, but has a stored value for a long period of time. Gold and silver are good examples of real money. Money is medium of exchange, stores high value in small amount of area. You see, 1 ounce of gold today is worth around $1,750 US. A medium of account, same value wherever you go in the world. Portable, it's easy to transport. Durable, doesn't corrode. The same gold that was used during the days of Moses is still around now. Divisible, you can make change with it. Fungible and interchangeable. Stored value, only gold and silver has retained its purchasing power. There have been thousands of fiat currencies that has all went to zero. So what is a fiat currency? A fiat is an arbitrary decree, order, or pronouncement given by a person, group, or body with the absolute authority to enforce it. A currency with its value that is derived from declaratory fiat or an authoritative order of the government is by definition a fiat currency. All currencies in use today are fiat currencies. In other words, the government declares that this piece of paper is worth something and we must believe it. We will see the dangers of this in just a moment because the value of fiat currencies always go to zero. So what was the monetary system like before the Federal Reserve? From roughly 1871 to 1914, when World War I began, most of the developed world operated under the classical gold standard, meaning most of the world's currencies were tied to gold. During the period when the world was operating under the classical gold standard, on average, there were no inflation of prices. During the classical gold standard, our currency was real, verifiable money. The currency was simply a receipt that represented actual gold and silver in the treasury. So why was the Federal Reserve developed? Well, in 1907, there was a financial crisis that took place in the United States over a 3-week period, starting in mid-October, when the New York Stock Exchange fell almost 50% from its peak the previous year. This is known as the Panic of 1907. It was widely believed that the big New York banks, known as the money trust, had been causing crashes and then capitalizing on them by buying stocks up from panicking investors and selling them for a tremendous profit just days or weeks later. This was devastating to the U.S. economy, and there was an outcry by the general public for the government to do something. In 1908, Congress created the National Monetary Commission to evaluate the situation and to recommend banking reforms that would prevent such panics. Senator Nelson Aldrich was appointed chairman of that commission. Long story short, Senator Nelson Aldrich invited the same bankers who caused the panic to a secret gathering at a secluded island. This gathering took place at Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia. There, the plans for a Federal Reserve System were drafted. Among the attendees were Paul Warburg, Kuhn, Loeb and Company, Abraham P. Andrew, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, Frank Vanderlip, President of the Rockefeller Lead National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, Senior Partner at J.P. Morgan, Charles D. Norton, the President of the Morgan-led First National Bank of New York, and Benjamin Strong, head of J.P. Morgan Bankers Trust, and to become the first Federal Reserve head. It is estimated that these men represented 1/4 of the world's wealth. Using fanciful and complex words, the agenda for some of the richest men in the world was cloaked under what we know now as the Federal Reserve Act. And because of its concealed nature, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by the 63rd United States Congress and signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson on December 23, 1913. And to add fuel to the fire, on March 4, 1933, Roosevelt was inaugurated, and within days, he signed executive proclamations closing all banks for a bank holiday, freezing foreign exchange, and preventing banks from paying out gold coin when they reopened. A month later, he signed an executive order requiring U.S. citizens to turn over their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for Federal Reserve notes. In other words, confiscating their property and increasing gold reserves for the U.S. government. So far, what you have seen in the United States started with the classical gold standard system using high-value commodity money such as gold and silver for exchanges. Then comes the Federal Reserve Act that was developed in response to the Panic of 1907. Then under President Roosevelt, the government convinces the population into accepting fiat currency by issuing paper demand notes that are redeemable in precious metals. These demand notes, also known as currency, are really just certificates of deposit, receipts, or claim checks on the real money that is in the vault. Not before long, the government started issuing more receipts than more gold that is in the vault through what is known as fractional reserve banking. In short form, the government created more receipts than what can be backed by gold in the vaults. This is fraud at the highest level. Throughout history, gold and silver always does in accounting. Gold and silver have revalued themselves throughout the centuries and called on fiat currencies to account for themselves. In doing so, gold and silver bring fraudulent money to justice. This has always been the case. Because the United States did not enter World War I for almost 3 years, it became the major supplier to the world during that time. Gold flowed into the U.S. at incredible rates, increasing its gold stocks by more than 60%. When the European allies could no longer pay in gold, since they have spent much of their gold on war, the U.S. extended them credit. Once the U.S. entered the war, however, it too spent at a rate far in excess of its income. The U.S. national debt went from $1 billion in 1916 to $25 billion by the end of the war. After the war, the world international trade market was in shambles. The world longed for the robust trade and economic stability of the international gold standard that had worked so well before the war. Thus, throughout the 1920s, most of the world governments returned to the traditional form of the gold standard. But it was not the classical gold standard that was before the war. As mentioned before, after the war, the United States had most of the world's gold. Conversely, many European countries had large supplies of U.S. dollars because they depleted their gold reserves during the war, and the U.S. granted them loans by supplying these European countries with the dollar. In 1944, in an effort to rebuild the international economic system while World War II was still raging, the Bretton Woods Agreement was established among 44 allied nations. This agreement established a new global monetary system. It replaced the gold standard with the U.S. dollar as the global currency. By doing so, it established the U.S. as the dominant power in the world economy. This is one of the main reasons why the U.S. is the world's superpower today. It is because of the influence it has in the world economy. By 1971, the Bretton Woods system had completely overwhelmed by the will of the public and the free markets. Gold had once again made an accounting. So, on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon stopped the convertibility of the U.S. dollar to gold.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was equivalent to the United States declaring bankruptcy. For the first time in U.S. history, the currency supply was entirely fiat. And since the Bretton Woods system had tied all the world's currencies to gold through the U.S. dollar, all currencies on the planet became fiat currencies simultaneously. Now, with the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, the dollar was freed from any fiscal constraints, allowing the U.S. to print as much fiat currency as it wanted, which it still does today. No other country has this hidden advantage that the U.S. has. This gives the U.S. the ability to 1. Run budget, trade, and other deficits and imbalances far in excess of anything the world has ever seen. And 2. To tax not only its own population, but also the population of the entire world through the inflation caused by its deficit spending. Inflation of a currency supply respects no borders. Every new dollar that is printed devalues all other dollars everywhere in the world. Around 95% of the currency in circulation today is created in the banking system. Let's discuss for a moment how the current banking system works. All banks operate under what you call fractional reserve banking. They all have a reserve requirement and must keep a certain amount of currency on hand for withdrawals. We're going to use 10% as an example. If the Federal Reserve requirement set by the Fed's Board of Governors is 10%, the bank must keep 10% of the currency deposited on hand just in case someone wants to make a withdrawal. However, they are allowed to loan out the other 90% of those deposits. Here's the kicker. They don't actually loan out the currency that's in the accounts. Instead, they create new fiat dollars out of nothing and then loan them out, which means they too are borrowed into existence. In other words, when you deposit $100, the bank then creates 90 brand new credit dollars with nothing but a book entry and then loan them out with interest. Then, if those brand new loan dollars are deposited in a checking account, the bank is allowed to loan out another 90% of the value of those deposits, and then another 90% of that. Then the process is repeated, and before you know it, $100 of Volt cash will turn into 1,000 of bank credit or digits. This may sound absurd, but here it is from the Federal Reserve themselves. Commercial banks create checkbook money whenever they grant a loan, simply by adding new deposit dollars on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. And they have the audacity to charge you late charges when you don't pay on time.
They say that money doesn't grow on trees, but the truth is that the modern banking system creates currency far faster than trees can grow. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain and just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest. But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't one penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, when you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction.
Now, pay attention because this is how the system robs you and I on a massive scale. See, we trade our time and freedom to work for currency which is not backed by anything. Then IRS takes 10 to 37% based on your income. The Treasury uses most of the money collected by IRS to pay national debt, not on infrastructure, schools, or any of that such. Money is then paid to the Federal Reserve for the check they wrote from a zero balance account. The Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It is a privately owned bank that has stockholders to whom it pays dividends. It has the power to create currency from thin air, and it's shielded from audits and congressional oversight. As former Senator and presidential candidate Barry Goldwater pointed out, the accounts of the Federal Reserve System have never been audited. It operates outside the control of Congress and manipulates the credit of the United States. We trade our time and our freedom for pieces of paper that is not backed by anything. Our skills, blood, sweat, and tears are what give the currency its value. We are the ones that give the money its value. So how will this system collapse? Well, as we stated before, massive amounts of currency is created in the banking system. This idea may seem good at first, but it has dire consequences. Price acts like a sponge. The more money there is in circulation, the more price will increase. Inflation occurs when there is an expansion of the currency supply. Conversely, deflation occurs when there is a contraction of the currency supply. The symptom of monetary inflation or deflation is rising or falling prices. Regardless, one thing is for sure. With inflation, everything becomes more valuable except fiat currency. In other words, your purchasing power becomes less. Look at how the prices of gas, gold, housing, and even healthcare have increased since 1971 when Nixon took the US dollar off of gold. One trick that the government likes to use in order to expand economic activity is quantitative easing. Quantitative easing occurs when the government increases the base currency to help bail out large commercial business or even create stimulus packages like the one we are receiving right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. Think about it just for a second. If the U.S. government is at $25 trillion in debt with no money in their savings account, where does the money from the stimulus package come from? Well, they must borrow it into existence. At the end of the day, this will not turn out good for the masses, and as we have learned, only the owners of the Federal Reserve, the private banks, will gain from this.
it is sometimes amazing that we haven't experienced more inflation than we have. If they keep expanding the money supply so vastly, why aren't our prices growing faster than they really are? And the answer is that a good chunk of the money that the Fed created has been shipped overseas. I remember early in my research, I heard this expression that the Americans have exported their inflation. I thought, what is that? How can you export your inflation? Put it in a box and send it out? What do you do? Well, now I understand. You export your inflation by simply sending all these dollars that you created to these other countries, and then they send you their refrigerators and their cars and whatever, their TV sets. So you get hardware, and they get little pieces of paper. It's a great deal for the American people for a while. For a while. Sooner or later, all of those pigeons come home to roost. When the time comes, as it looks like it's now coming, when the rest of the world is saying, we don't want to play this game anymore, Uncle Sam's dollars are just becoming worthless, there are too many of them, we've got to find something else other than American dollars, then those dollars start to come back to America. People say, we don't want them anymore, what do we do with them? Once this revs up and we've got this little trickle of money coming back that we previously exported, once it becomes a flood and it starts to rush back, now we are getting our former exported inflation brought back to us, and then we'll see the quantity of money inside the United States grow much more rapidly even than the Federal Reserve can create it, because we're getting a previous money back. And that's when we will really see the tanking of the US dollar in terms of what it will buy.
Countries are now realizing that the U.S. is running a Ponzi scheme and have been returning the U.S. dollar back to this country. Some are even trading amongst themselves with their own currency instead of using the U.S. dollar, which was established as the international trade currency. Since more money will circulate into the U.S. economy, the Fed will have no other choice than to raise interest rates. When interest rates rise, then price will absorb the currency expansion like a sponge.
The US dollar is about 60% of the value of all the currency on the planet, and more than half of the dollars reside outside the United States. The reason every country has US dollars is, first of all, that's what central banks use as the reserve currency. Second of all, oil is priced in dollars. So, this is the world. And what you see here is that these are the countries that are avoiding the US dollar in trade. They're doing bilateral agreements where they'll either hold each other's currency and settle that way, or they're establishing, like right now, they're talking about a BRICS bank, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, having a bank that will do settlements between the countries directly without using the US dollar. I'll show you later that China is accumulating an immense amount of gold, but all the countries with an up arrow, that's gold accumulation. Then we have gold repatriation. Germany has been asking for their gold back, and they're getting it. Venezuela has repatriated their gold from the Bank of England. And then if we put this on a timeline, here's the nails in the coffin for the dollar standard, and you will see that there's not a lot of time left. This is my evidence that I think is proof that the death of the dollar is coming, and it's coming shortly. Nixon ended Bretton Woods, and we went on the dollar standard. Then the first nail in the coffin is Iraq sells oil in euros. The crisis of 2008, and we added 1.25 trillion to our base money in the United States. As we add to the base currency, people get worried about inflation. They start rushing toward gold and silver. Iran ends oil sales in dollars, and they're taking commodities in trade for oil. They're taking, in Turkey, they take the local currency and then buy gold in Turkey and export the gold to Iran. So they're basically selling oil for gold. They do the same thing with India. QE2, quantitative easing, that's more currency printing in the United States. Libya, China and Russia bypassed the dollar. They did a bilateral trade agreement where they hold each other's currency, and they do direct debt settlement without having to wire transfer US dollars. Chinese president just recently said that the dollar as the world's reserve currency is a product of the past. Utah recognized silver and gold as money. China and Iran bypassed the US dollar with a bilateral trade agreement. Venezuela repatriates its gold. China and Japan trade directly. India and Japan bypass the US dollar. Russia and Iran trade directly. Iran sells India oil for rupees and commodities. China and Brazil trade directly. Swiss citizens demand gold repatriation. African countries ban the dollar. In Zambia, you can go to jail if you use US dollars. Quantitative easing number 3. They have announced at the Federal Reserve that they're starting with $40 billion of currency that they're creating each month, and now it jumps to $85 billion. That's more than $1 trillion a year. And remember, it took 200 years to go from no dollars to 825 billion, and now they're going to create $1 trillion every year.
Fed will eventually bring about the collapse of the U.S. economy. All of the currency in the world are tied to the U.S. dollar. If the U.S. dollar goes under, all of the currencies will go under with it. The current financial system is unconstitutional and evil, continually enriching the wealthy and indebting the poor. That is why the founding fathers did not want a central banking system in place and establish gold and silver as money. Presidents like John F. Kennedy wanted to return to the gold standard. In other words, he wanted to get rid of the Federal Reserve, and he was assassinated for this. Just like Egypt, when the economy reaches a state where the middle class has to spend 40% of their income on food, riots begin. Imagine what will happen when the 73 million baby boomers who are retiring need to take distributions from their IRAs and come to find out that their investments are worth close to zero. This will be devastating. Baby boomers always shift society at every stage of their lives. The biggest concern is that dictatorship can rise during a financial crisis. Just like Hitler, who rose during one of the lowest periods in the history of the German economy. He was a captivating speaker who played on their panic and fear of the people. He promised to make things better, and the Germans believed him. As you know, this story did not have a good ending. Government used crises as opportunities to take away our freedom and impose their agenda during times of distress, even now during this pandemic.
American history have politicians been more powerful than they are now. Effectively, they are gods. In the state of Maine, for example, Governor Janet Mills now has the power to suspend any law she doesn't like. She can seize any state resource she feels like seizing. She can force any citizen or all citizens from their home. She can do all of this for as long as she wants, as long as she believes Maine is in a state of emergency. In fact, there's virtually nothing that Janet Mills can't now do. Many governors now have these powers. J.B. Pritzker is the governor of Illinois. On Monday, Pritzker did his best to explain why his word is now law in the state. It has to be law, he explained. Otherwise, thousands would die.
I believe that the upcoming global collapse will give rise to a new power, a new monetary system, a new world order, and eventually a new religious order. You see, it is too late to turn back the tides of the pending financial storm. The storm is on the horizon, and the most important question is, how can we prepare? Many who know about this storm are investing in gold and silver, since the value of precious metal will increase when the US dollar collapses. You may recall on TV an ad, "We buy gold." Big investors are trying to buy up as much precious metals as they can and dramatically drive up its prices during the collapse. By the time the public catches on, they would have sold all of their gold to big investors and would not be able to purchase them back since the price of gold and silver will be too expensive. So then what? I believe God has another plan for his people. This plan is called the Eden economy. God wants his people to redirect their resources from Babylon's collapsing economy into our own God-given economy. We are told in inspiration that in the future, the problem of buying and selling will be a very serious one. That means Before this crisis, we must have a system of living that is not based on buying or selling. This is one of the great objectives of the Eden economy. God wants to bring his people to a place where, in order to sustain life, all they need is to depend on God and each other. This was the experience that the people of God had in the days of the apostles, just before the early rain. This must be the experience of the people of God, just before the latter rain and the loud cry. Acts chapter 4, verse 32, 34, and 35 says, "And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things common. Neither was there any among them that lacked. For as many as their possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet. And distribution was made unto every man according as he had need." These verses demonstrate the type of economy that we must build or bring into existence. In other words, we have another ark to build. Noah didn't build the ark overnight. It took him 120 years. However, we don't have 120 years. What it has taken others years to learn, we will have to learn in a few months. Our study was just an overview of the current financial system and the pending collapse. If you want more information about this, we recommend that you watch the Hidden Secrets of Money series by Mike Maloney. Also, we recommend that you read his book. You may have questions about the Eden economy. We will be discussing more of that topic in our next series. May God bless you and your family. Stay safe, my friends.